Due process is the legal principle that serves as the foundation of our country's judicial system. And it's a term we're hearing a lot these days as the Trump administration faces off with judges across the U.S. Case in point, the hundreds of men living in the U.S. illegally that were shipped off to a prison in El Salvador. None of them were given due process. The administration claimed that because they were deported under the Alien Enemies Act, they weren't entitled to due process. The case went up to the Supreme Court, who ruled that the government could use the Alien Enemies Act, but they still had to give the deportees notice that they were going to be deported and an opportunity to challenge the deportation. In other words, due process. We still don't know what's going to happen to the 200-plus men who are already in El Salvador. The Supreme Court literally left their fate in limbo. But what about the millions of other people still living here in the U.S. illegally? The president talked about them in the Oval Office yesterday. Listen here.
And I hope we get cooperation from the courts because, you know, we have thousands of people that are ready to go out, and you can't have a trial for all of these people. It wasn't meant, the system wasn't meant, and we don't think there's anything that a judge can't say, no, you have to have a trial. The trial's going to take 2 years.
So the president said you can't have a trial for all of these people. The system wasn't meant for that, and they don't think that there's anything that says that. Well, if by trial he means due process, there is something that says something about that. It's the bedrock of our country, otherwise known as the Constitution. The 5th and 14th Amendments address due process. The 5th Amendment saying, quote, no person shall be deprived of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Now notice it says no person, no qualifiers on that. The Supreme Court stated it very clearly in a 1976 ruling saying, quote, there are literally millions of aliens within the jurisdiction of the United States. The 5th Amendment, as well as the 14th Amendment, protects every one of these persons from deprivation of life, liberty, or property without due process of law. Here to unpack this with us is constitutional attorney and Hamline University professor David Schultz. David, great to see you. You know, what stuck out to me about the president's statement was his concern about time, saying that a trial would take 2 years. And then on social media, he later wrote, quote, we cannot give everyone a trial because to do so would take, without exaggeration, 200 years, end quote. So David, how does this concern over time align with the constitutional right of due process?
Well, there's a couple of different things here. First is that the Constitution is not supposed to be about time. It's about process. And it's about something very simple as saying that if the government is charging you with a crime or saying you've done something wrong, you have a right to challenge that and to force the government to prove its case. If you think about it, the basic fundamental principle of a free society is that the government bears the burden of proof. We've all seen this on how many cops and robber shows. They've got to prove their case. I have my day in court to be able to force the government to do things. Now, in a criminal trial, we can have lots of parts of what are due process. But these are what we're going to call administrative hearings that don't have quite the same requirements as as let us say, a criminal trial. And even most criminal trials don't take 2 years. Administrative trials, administrative hearings can be relatively quick. But the basic point is, I think Trump got it wrong on the time frame, that it's not about the issue of time. It's about the issue of rights and about what, let's say, getting decisions correct.
Okay. So, you know, back in 2013, under President Obama, a record 363,000 deportations were carried out without appearing before a judge. Now, they did it through either a process called expedited removal or by using previous orders of deportation. So many people are hearing that number and wondering, why doesn't Trump just use these types of procedures?
Okay, we have to think about a difference in terms of what's happening here. That expedited removal is occurring when individuals have, let us say, are literally just entering the United States illegally. I don't want to call it sort of like why they're in hot pursuit. You know, they've jumped the fence, they've swam the river, whatever it is. They're coming in and they're being chased at this point. And at that point, you can grab them and return them back because they're not legally in the United States. And the same thing with individuals who have already had hearings, have been told they've had their day in court. They must leave. And for some reason, they've escaped authorities. They've had their day in court. Those are very different situations here than individuals who are already in the United States. And granted, they may be here illegally, but those individuals who are here now are entitled to a hearing because they may make a request for asylum, or the government may be accusing of being here illegally when they're actually here legally. So there's a big difference between what Obama was using in that act and what Trump seems to be doing right now. And so, but if Trump wanted to say people who are, let's say, literally just quickly entering the United States and before they've actually sort of settled here, wants to use that act for that purpose, he could do that.
So he could use it, but it doesn't apply in the situation that a lot of these deportations are taking place right now. Is that what you're saying?
Exactly correct. Yeah. Again, if I can sort of, again, I hate to use kind of a stereotype here, but it's like the person who has just entered the United States is still fleeing to try to get into the United States. That's when you can use that act because they've just gotten here, as opposed to somebody who's already settled in the United States.
Okay. You know, David, a CBS News 60 Minutes report found that of those 235 men that the administration sent to El Salvador last month without any hearings or due process, 75% of them actually had no trace of a criminal record. And of those that did have records, the majority of them were nonviolent offenses like trespassing and shoplifting.
Right.
You know, that seems like information that should have been vetted before they were sent to CCOT.
You're absolutely correct. And that's the whole purpose of having a hearing. Now, we can have a great debate regarding whether somebody who's trespassed should be allowed to stay in the United States. And that's a matter for the policymakers or the judges to think about. But for the fact that all those people, if it's correct here, had really no offenses, that is something they should be able to raise before a judge and say, listen, I've done nothing wrong. I have a clean slate, and here's why I should be entitled to stay in the United States. Again, go back to what I was mentioning before. The whole purpose of hearings force the government to make its case. Because if we just let the government round up, quote, the usual suspects, lots of mistakes and lots of rights are going to be violated.
Yeah, it may take a little bit of time, but it's right to do it the right way, right? David Schultz, thanks so much for sharing your expertise with us tonight.